My fingers traced the grain of the old window frame, the peeling white paint flaking away like forgotten memories to reveal the strong oak beneath. This wasn't just a house, it was a promise I'd made to myself, a small Victorian cottage on the New England coast. Purchased with every dollar I'd ever saved. It was my sanctuary, my masterpiece. As I pried a loose board from the living room wall, my hand brushed against something cold. It was a tarnished tin music box the moment I opened it. A fragile, hopeful melody filled the dusty air. And that's when I heard it, the distinct sound of a key turning in my front door lock. A door I knew I had bolted shut from the inside. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Alice, and my fingers trace the grain of the old window frame, the peeling white paint flaking away like forgotten memories to reveal the strong oak beneath. This wasn't just a house. It was a promise I'd made to myself, a small Victorian cottage on the New England coast, purchased with every dollar I'd ever saved from years of meticulously restoring antique furniture for other people. It was my sanctuary, my masterpiece, a place where the scent of salt and old wood promised a future I would build with my own two hands. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floorboards as I worked, carefully prying a loose board from the living room wall where I suspected a draft was coming from. My work was slow and deliberate, a conversation with the house itself. My hand brushed against something cold and solid tucked deep within the wall cavity. With a final gentle tug, I pulled out a tarnished tin music box, its surface etched with the delicate image of a hummingbird sipping nectar from a flower. A sense of reverence washed over me as I held the small treasure. It felt like a secret shared between me and the home's original owners. The moment I unlatched the tiny clasp, a fragile, hopeful melody filled the dusty air, a ghost of a lullaby from a century past. And that's when I heard it, the distinct, jarring sound of a key turning in my front door lock, a door I knew for a fact I had bolted shut from the inside. My mother, Catherine, and my older sister, Sophia, stood framed in the doorway, their presence instantly sucking the peaceful air out of the room. My mother's smile was a bright, artificial thing that didn't belong in the quiet history of my home, while Sophia clutched a thick sheaf of floral wallpaper samples, the kind of garish patterns she knew I despised. They looked less like visitors and more like an occupying force. "We thought we'd surprise you, darling," my mother chirped, her voice gliding over the question I hadn't yet asked about how they'd gotten in. She breezed past me, her expensive perfume clashing with the scent of sawdust and turpentine. Sophia, wasting no time, marched directly to the dining room wall, a wall I had spent the entire previous week painstakingly scraping clean of decades of old paper. She held up a sample with gaudy pink roses against the beautifully exposed plaster. "This room will be perfect for the kids. Don't you think it gets so much natural light for them to play?" she declared, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. A cold knot formed in my stomach as the unspoken truth of their visit began to unfurl, piece by horrifying piece. They had a plan, one they had clearly discussed at length without me. The plan was for Sophia, who was in the middle of a messy divorce, to move in with her two children, into my house, into my sanctuary. My mother placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip surprisingly firm, her smile never faltering as it turned into something chillingly serene. "Oh, Alice, I think you've misunderstood," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This was always the plan. We were just waiting for you to take care of the down payment." The invasion didn't stop with their words. It escalated into a meticulously orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare. A few days later, the first email from my father. Arthur arrived, a retired lawyer. He had a way of twisting language into a weapon, and the email was a masterclass in veiled threats, citing obscure legal precedents about familial obligations, and hinting that I could be sued for breach of trust for using what he termed joint family funds to buy the house. The very next day, I received a call from a major client, a wealthy collector for whom I was restoring an entire suite of Regency-era furniture. He was pulling the contract, effective immediately. He sounded apologetic but firm, mentioning he'd heard about my unfortunate and complicated family crisis and didn't want his valuable pieces caught in any potential legal crossfire. There was no doubt in my mind who had planted that seed. My phone rang again that evening. It was my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's sister, who usually remained neutral in family disputes. Her voice was syrupy with concern. "Alice, dear, your mother told me everything. I know you've always been the independent one, but to put your own sister out on the street, it's just not right." I tried to explain, but my words were met with a wall of practiced pity. I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was a scripted lecture. My family wasn't just trying to take my house. They were systematically poisoning my reputation, isolating me from anyone who might listen. Simultaneously, Sophia launched her offensive on social media. She posted carefully staged photos of her children looking forlorn in their cramped apartment, accompanied by long, rambling captions about the heartbreak of a single mother being turned away by her successful younger sister. My phone buzzed with notifications from distant relatives and old family friends, offering Sophia their sympathy, their words dripping with unspoken judgment directed at me. Then came the phone call from my niece, Lily, her small voice trembling. "Auntie Alice, Mommy's crying again. She said you don't love us anymore because we don't have a big house like yours." The manipulation was so blatant, so cruel. It stole the air from my lungs. The attacks became more direct. My father used his legal connections to have a frivolous cease and desist letter sent to my own lawyer, accusing him of unethical client coaching in an attempt to intimidate him. Sophia created a community support Facebook group, which was nothing more than a platform to post daily, distorted updates about her struggle, even posting my home address, which led to a few of her supporters driving slowly past my house at all hours. Then came the official notice from the city. A complaint had been filed for zoning violations, claiming I was operating a commercial business with hazardous chemicals in a residential area. The forced inspection threatened my very livelihood. Pushed into a corner, I began my own quiet rebellion. I had security cameras installed, discreetly placed to cover all entrances. I started recording every phone call, my finger hovering over the screen as my father's booming voice lectured me on loyalty. One evening, 2 police officers appeared at my door, stating they'd received an anonymous call for a wellness check, claiming I was unstable and a danger to myself. I calmly showed them my security system and explained the situation. They left with apologetic looks, but the violation lingered for days. My sanctuary had been breached by a lie. The final straw was an alert from my bank about suspicious login attempts. The IP address was from a public library 2 blocks from my parents' house. I spent a whole day on the phone, freezing accounts and changing passwords, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. The psychological warfare intensified. My mother began leaving gifts on my porch, a worn teddy bear from my childhood, a faded copy of my favorite book each, with a note saying, "Remember when we were happy?" It was a twisted, cloying attempt to weaponize my own memories against me. My ex-boyfriend called, bewildered. My parents had contacted him, asking probing questions about my past relationships and financial habits, clearly digging for dirt. The most painful tactic came through my niece. Sophia coached Lily to leave me tearful voicemails, begging me to let them move in so she could have a real bedroom for her birthday. The weight of their coordinated emotional blackmail was suffocating. Then, my father escalated the financial sabotage. I received a letter from a credit card company, welcoming me as a new premium member. I had never applied for it. A quick call confirmed my worst fears. A card had been opened in my name, using my social security number, and had been maxed out on luxury goods and cash advances totaling over $10,000. The statements were being sent to my parents' address. It was a calculated move to destroy my credit, a bureaucratic nightmare that took weeks of sworn affidavits and fraud reports to untangle. Just as I was drowning in paperwork, a message appeared from Sophia's ex-husband, Mark. He sounded surprisingly sympathetic, apologizing for Sophia's behavior and offering to provide a written statement about her history of financial manipulation. It felt like a lifeline, a potential crack in their united front. He claimed he wanted to help, for the sake of his children and for the sake of the truth. Against my better judgment, a small part of me felt a flicker of hope. The statement he sent my lawyer was a Trojan horse. It was a masterpiece of deceit, twisting every event to paint me as a jealous, vindictive sister who had always resented Sophia's natural charm. He claimed I had driven a wedge between them and was now trying to ruin her life out of spite. My family immediately weaponized it, plastering excerpts all over social media as proof from an unbiased source. The betrayal was staggering, a reminder that I was truly alone in this fight. The relentless campaign, now bolstered by Mark's false testimony, began to take a real toll. The owner of the local hardware store, a man I'd known for years, politely asked me to take my business elsewhere, mumbling about not wanting any drama. I was being slowly but surely erased from my own community. One rainy afternoon, an elderly client, Mrs. Gable, for whom I was restoring a beautiful secretary desk, asked me to stay for tea. She looked at me with kind, knowing eyes. "My dear," she said, "I know what you're going through. My youngest son was the safety net for his brother for 30 years. She told me her story, one of quiet sacrifice and eventual, painful estrangement. She was the first person who saw my situation not as family drama, but as the abuse it truly was. She introduced me to a freelance journalist, a woman named Sarah, who specialized in stories of hidden domestic abuse. After much soul-searching, I agreed to an interview on the condition of complete anonymity. The article, titled "The Gilded Cage: When Family Love Becomes a Life Sentence," was published in a respected regional magazine. It detailed the patterns of financial exploitation, the golden child and scapegoat dynamic, and the psychological toll of being the designated family provider, all without using a single name. The response was overwhelming. The magazine's website was flooded with comments from people sharing similar stories. The article had given a voice to a silent, widespread pain. The story's publication sent my family into a panic. Though anonymous, the details were specific enough that their friends and colleagues began to gossip. My father, in a fit of arrogant rage, had his lawyer send a threatening letter to the magazine, demanding a retraction and accusing them of defamation. This backfired spectacularly, as the magazine's legal team responded by publishing a statement defending their journalistic integrity, which only fanned the flames and drew more attention to the original article. Their carefully constructed facade was cracking under the pressure. A few nights later, there was a frantic pounding at my door. It was Sophia, but not the smug, entitled sister I knew. She was disheveled, her eyes red from crying. She begged me for money, claiming her landlord was evicting her and the children would be on the street. It was a raw, desperate performance, a shift from entitlement to pitiable victimhood. I looked at her, and for a moment, the old conditioning kicked in, but then I saw the calculation in her eyes. I wrote down the number for the county's Family Services Department and handed it to her. "They can help you, Sophia," I said, my voice even. "I can't." I began digging through my own past with a new urgency, searching through boxes of old papers in the attic for anything that could help the lawyer I had been forced to hire. In a dusty shoebox tucked under my old bed, I found my college diaries, flipping through the pages. One entry stopped my heart. It was dated the spring of my sophomore year, the year I was supposed to go to a prestigious art restoration program in Florence. Mom and Dad said all the money they saved for my art school fund was lost in a bad investment. I had written, "My dream is over." I cross-referenced the date, and a wave of nausea washed over me as the pieces clicked into place. It was the exact same week Sophia had called off her first lavish wedding, forcing my parents to forfeit a massive non-refundable deposit to the venue. Deeper in the same box, under a stack of old photos, I found a thick, unopened envelope. It was an acceptance letter from a local university's art program. A very good one, with a generous scholarship offer. I had never seen it before. It was postmarked a week before my parents told me about the bad investment. They hadn't just stolen my dream of Florence, they had hidden a perfectly viable alternative, ensuring I remained close to home, dependent and controllable. They hadn't lost the money. They had used my future to pay for her mistake. As I sat there with the decades-old betrayal in my hands, the world outside seemed to fall away. The sound of the mail slot clanking shut downstairs barely registered until I went to retrieve the day's post. It was a certified letter, not from my father, but from a law firm I had never heard of, formally notifying me that eviction proceedings were being initiated against me. The letter claimed I was merely the custodial trustee of a property purchased with funds from a family trust. They were trying to erase me from my own life story. The family mediation my parents arranged at their lawyer's office felt more like an inquisition. I was seated alone on one side of a large mahogany table, while my parents and Sophia sat united on the other, a panel of judges ready to deliver their verdict. Their lawyer, a man with a practiced, sympathetic smile, slid a document across the table toward me. It was a settlement offer sign over 50% of the property deed to Sophia, and they would graciously drop the lawsuit. They sat back, smug and confident, believing they had finally checkmated me. I said nothing. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and pressed play. A man's voice, clear and unmistakable, filled the silent room. It was my father's. Just create whatever paperwork you need to make the trust look legitimate. The recording of his voice said, "She'll never know the difference." It was a voicemail he had accidentally left me, a message intended for his lawyer. The lawyer's face went pale. My mother stared, her mouth agape. I then calmly placed my old diary on the table, opened to the page about my lost art school fund, next to a bank statement from that same year showing a large withdrawal. "The family trust you're referring to," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, "was my college tuition. It was the future you stole from me to clean up Sophia's mess." The silence in the room was absolute, thick with years of unspoken truths. It was Sophia who broke it, her voice a high-pitched shriek. "She's lying. She's always been selfish when we were kids. She made me give away my puppy just because she claimed she was allergic." I met my sister's frantic gaze, and my voice was as cold and sharp as ice. "Sophia, I was in the emergency room for 3 days with anaphylactic shock. You told everyone I had the flu." The final mask had been ripped away, and for the first time, they were all exposed in the harsh, unflattering light of the truth. After the confrontation at the lawyer's office, my father, in a final act of desperation, tried to intimidate my lawyer, threatening to file a frivolous complaint with the state bar. My lawyer simply laughed. "Arthur," he said over the phone while I was in his office, "I've been waiting 20 years for you to try something like this with me." The lawsuit was dropped the next day, a week later. My mother appeared at my door alone. There were no threats, only a carefully rehearsed plea. She offered a compromise. They would help Sophia get a condo if I would just admit I had overreacted and agree to family therapy. It was one last attempt to control the narrative, to make me the one who needed fixing. I looked at her, at the woman who had orchestrated so much of my pain, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a quiet finality. "No," I said, and gently closed the door. Just when I thought the worst was over, my Aunt Beatrice appeared at my door with a realtor, claiming the family wanted to appraise the property for a buyout. She had a key my mother had given her. I had to call the police to have them escorted off my lawn. That same week, a distant cousin contacted me. He told me my parents had done something similar years ago to his father, pressuring him to sell an inherited property and loan them the money, which was never repaid. The predatory pattern ran deeper than I could have imagined. But then, a turning point. The client who had pulled his contract called to apologize profusely and reinstated the job with a generous advance. The city inspector for the zoning complaint, a woman my age, dismissed the case and recommended I join a local women's business network. Small pockets of support began to appear in the wreckage. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected place. While restoring an old writing desk my parents had given me for my high school graduation, my fingers found a loose panel at the back. Inside was a hidden compartment. It contained a small stack of letters and a life insurance policy document. The policy was on my life, taken out when I was 10, with Sophia as the sole beneficiary. But it was a letter from my mother to my father, written when I was a teenager. That made the world stop. "We must guide Alice toward a stable, practical career," she wrote. "Her quiet nature will make her the perfect safety net for Sophia's more volatile future. She will be the anchor that allows Sophia to fly." It was there in black and white. My entire life had been a premeditated sacrifice. A year later, the morning sun streamed through the large, curtainless windows of my fully restored Victorian home. My garden was filled with the sound of quiet conversation and laughter, not from my family, but from a small group of young women sharing their stories. After severing all ties, I used a portion of the money from a major restoration project to establish the Hummingbird Foundation, a small nonprofit offering legal aid and emotional support to people trying to escape financially abusive family situations. My house, once a battlefield, had become a true sanctuary. My worth was no longer measured by their approval, but by the strength I found in turning my own pain into a purpose. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know what you did," it read. "You will pay for this." I looked at the words. Feeling not a flicker of the old fear or guilt, I calmly deleted the message, my fingers steady. I turned back to the women in my garden, a genuine, peaceful smile gracing my lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The threat was empty, a hollow echo from a past I no longer inhabited. They couldn't touch me anymore. I was no longer the woman they thought they knew.